Hello, I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to People in Profit, your default business news roundup. Coming up, a budget overshadowed by Brexit, but will the UK's Finance Minister be able to win over the public with his spending plan? Dancing around a default, we look at the possible outcomes of Venezuela's debt crisis. And Island for Sale, how the residents of one Scottish outpost are trying to make their home their own. First up, though, the pressure is on Britain's Finance Minister to deliver a bold budget for next year. Philip Hammond needs to strike the right balance to bolster Prime Minister Theresa May's fragile coalition. But an economy weakened by uncertainty over Brexit means he'll have only limited room for manoeuvre. Catherine Clifford reports.
It's a dreary outlook for the UK economy. Economic growth is now slower than that of the Eurozone, and the European Commission predicts even more of a slowdown over the next couple of years, saying it'll grow by 1.5% this year and 1.2% in 2018. That's compared to 2% last year. The report explained this is largely prompted by uncertainty in the wake of Brexit. The effects are already being felt in the value of sterling, which has fallen sharply since the UK voted to leave the EU. That makes imported goods more expensive and has driven inflation to its highest level in 5 years. In October, the rate of price rises was 3%, according to Britain's Office for National Statistics. For essentials like food and non-alcoholic drinks, it was even higher at 4.1%, meaning poorer households are being harder hit. Meanwhile, UK unemployment currently sits at 4.3%. That's the lowest for the country since 1975. But the problem is that wages aren't growing. In fact, inflation has overtaken wage growth, which is just over 2%. But there are some bright spots. Retail sales, often considered a good indicator of an economy's health, are rising. And London's FTSE 100 stock market index is close to record highs as exporters benefit from the weaker pound.
Well, for more on this, let's go to London and speak to Neil Wilson, who's Senior Market Analyst at ETX Capital. Neil, thanks for being with us. What's of those economic factors we were just talking about, what's the biggest issue going into this budget?
I think the biggest issue has to be productivity. The problem with productivity has been one that's in Britain for the last 10 years since the financial crisis, and it's something that economists and the Bank of England and businesses are really struggling to deal with, and it is probably the single biggest issue, and I think it's got to be top of the agenda for Philip Hammond as he seeks to engineer some kind of fiscal reforms that might stimulate growth. And I think really anything that can boost productivity is going to be welcome.
And how does that play into his room for manoeuvre when it comes to new spending or tax cuts or changes for the British economy?
Well, I think really he's got very little room for manoeuvre. The key being that the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is almost certain to revise its productivity expectations lower. It's been thinking that productivity will increase by around 1.6% per year over the next 5 years. Of course, we're not at nothing like that. It's actually declined this year, although the recent figures for the last 3 months have shown a bit of an improvement. So the OBR is going to revise that down, and that's really going to impact the forecasts for tax receipts and so on. So that's going to wipe out any of the kind of headroom of Brexit war chest that Philip Hammond thought he was going to have.
What sort of measures will you and the markets be looking out for when we eventually get details of what's in the budget?
Well, I think that any significant reforms are probably off the table. Any sort of fiscal reform, lower tax rates and so on, are not on the table at all. Some infrastructure spending, whether or not he will actually borrow more to do that seems unlikely, because of course he seems to be keen to stick to his fiscal targets, however loose they are. And I think there might be some specific measures in there. For example, for house builders, there's a big emphasis at the moment on the lack of housing in the UK and what the Conservative government can do about that. So I think they will be keen to support house building, but whether or not that's on the demand side or the supply side remains to be seen. Any major £50 billion infrastructure house building programme that's been talked about seems really unlikely. And then aside from that, perhaps there might be some some relief on business rates and some other kind of giveaways to businesses to help them over the line over the Brexit negotiations period.
Is Brexit just the spectre hanging over this budget, or do you think we'll hear specific Brexit-related measures in what Philip Hammond will tell us?
I don't envisage specific measures yet. We've not seen the drop-off in the economy, the major drop-off in the economy that had been predicted. The government's not yet had to borrow more. That's the key thing, and I think without having had to borrow more already, it's not going to seek to do any further borrowing at the moment, and keep it sort of its ammunition in reserve for later on. I think next year, if there is a problem with the Brexit negotiations, we're talking about a 50-50 chance now of no deal. If there is no deal, then increased borrowing will need to be looked at then.
OK, Neil Wilson, Senior Market Analyst at ETX Capital, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Next, the vultures are circling around Venezuela's debt mountain after the country missed a number of payment deadlines. Over the years, financial institutions and others have bought debt from Venezuela and its energy giant, PDVSA. They invested in the hope of high returns, essentially lending money to the state coffers. The oil-rich nation has managed to service its debts for much longer than many investors expected. But President Nicolas Maduro has finally admitted they need to negotiate with their creditors.
They're betting that Venezuela will default. But Venezuela will never default. It will never happen. Venezuela will always have a clear strategy, and now our strategy is to renegotiate and refinance all of Venezuela's external debt, because we will not continue down this road.
Venezuela isn't the only country to have faced the prospect of bankruptcy. Kate Moody's here with more. Kate.
Well, Stephen, Caracas is thought to owe around $150 billion to creditors around the world. It includes around $1.7 billion that the state-run oil giant is due to pay this month. A similar amount of interest is owed on various bonds by the end of the year, and over $8 billion is due next year. If Venezuela refuses or is unable to make those payments, the fallout could be huge. A government in default is immediately blocked from the international lending market, cutting off its access to loans as its own coffers dwindle. Creditors could begin to confiscate assets held overseas. Most valuable could be Venezuelan oil shipments. Providers of food and medicine could decide to stop imports for fear they won't get paid. That could push an already struggling population further into humanitarian crisis. Now, there have been hundreds of cases of sovereign debt defaults throughout history, with varying consequences. The first notable one was Philip II of Spain in 1557. Mexico defaulted during the peso crisis of the 1990s. Zimbabwe was locked out of the international markets for years after its 1999 default. And Argentina has defaulted twice since the turn of the century. Buenos Aires' recovery since then is widely seen as a success story in the region. A first round of negotiations persuaded some creditors to take a haircut on their investment. After more than a decade of stalemate, it was eventually able to issue new bonds and use the proceeds to pay off the remaining holdouts. Ukraine was able to avoid a default in 2016 by going straight to the IMF to restructure its $18 billion debt pile and receiving a bailout package to keep the bills being paid. Now, crucially, both those countries carried out massive economic reforms to boost confidence in their future. But Nicolas Maduro has promised no such thing. That gives him little leverage to persuade bondholders to accept smaller returns or push back their deadlines. Even if they were willing, US and EU sanctions restrict most financial institutions from conducting any business with members of Maduro's regime, leaving the country sinking deeper into debt and isolation. Stephen?
Kate, thank you very much for that. Now, next, an island for sale, prime location, 5 current residents. But the inhabitants of the Isle of Ulva off the Scottish coast are hoping to become the new owners. They need to raise around €4.5 million for the purchase. Their quest has been helped by a law which allows the sale to be put on hold while they raise the funds. William Edwards reports.
There are dark clouds on the horizon for Rebecca Monroe. One of just 5 residents on the Scottish Isle of Ulva, she fears her island home will be sold to a foreign buyer. After decades of ownership by an aristocratic family, remote and spectacular Ulva is now on the market for around £4 million. But its residents hope to raise enough money to buy it themselves.
The community buyout offers us some, definite security that we don't have at the moment. It offers people who live here a say in their future, and I think when you offer people a stake in where they live, it encourages them to contribute to their community, to stay in the area and to create a future for themselves here that they probably wouldn't do under private ownership.
It's something that has been done before. 20 years ago, the nearby island of Egg was bought by its residents with the help of an anonymous benefactor. Today, Egg has a thriving population, its own renewable energy grid and good links to the mainland.
What's happened on Egg is that slowly, you know, people have got that security. A lot of our young people have come back to live here, actually, started to have kids of their own. So it's a real kind of vibrant feeling, and I think, you know, that's happened because we bought Egg.
But for Ulva's residents, the future is uncertain. A new law introduced last year has allowed residents to suspend the sale to give them time to get the money together. With just 7 months to go, they're pinning their hopes on government funds or generous private donors to help them do it.
That's it from us for this week, but if you have any questions about the stories we've been covering, you can get in touch on Facebook at France 24 Business, or you can tweet me at NewStephen. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Natalie Savarikas, and you'll usually find me in news, reporting on Greece's enduring financial turmoil and protests, but also the refugee emergency, here on France 24.
Natalie Savarikas, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.